Oh, hello Dragonfly Swarm. Layla's finally here! She's a 4-star cryo sword user who specializes as a shield support for your teams, but she can actually also dish out a decent amount of her own damage while providing shields, energy, and cryo application to your team, making her a pretty versatile character. It's also slightly surprising how well she fits into Dendro teams, so that'll be a point of discussion as well, because my initial assumption was that she would play primarily under the same meta that most cryo characters work in, but I was wrong. So in this video, I'm gonna explain everything you'll need to know about Layla in 3.2, from how her kit works to her best builds, the value of her constellations, all of the crazy fun teams she plays in, and so on and so forth. But before I start, if this video helps you, please consider subscribing, as it very much helps my channel and I would super appreciate it. So we're gonna start studying this studious character by first taking a look at her kit, because at a baseline, it's actually quite simple. Layla's attack talent isn't something you'll be using very often in most cases, unless you plan on using her as an on-fielder, but even that's a bit of a rare case considering the teams she plays in. Nonetheless, the talent itself allows Layla to perform a 3-hit combo, and her attack speed is relatively slow, but the modifiers on the attacks aren't terrible. So the best scenarios to use her normal attacks are in teams where you don't have a dedicated on-field driver and you just want to weave in a little bit of extra damage. However, since she is a cryo character, she does have easy access to superconduct for those of you that want to play her as a physical main DPS. Other than that though, you'll usually be ignoring her attack talent and instead focusing on the bread and butter of her entire kit, her elemental skill! Casting Layla's skill will summon a curtain of slumber shield, and this shield has some pretty unique attributes. Firstly, it scales quite well per level, and its strength scales based on Layla's max HP, plus an extra flat amount of hit points. And in terms of how tanky her shield is as opposed to other shielders, at a baseline, it is quite a bit stronger than Diona's shield, competitive with Toma's shield, and obviously inferior to Zhongli's shield. Also note that the duration and the cooldown of this ability are identical at 12 seconds, so Layla's shield does theoretically have the luxury of 100% uptime. But the shield actually has another interesting attribute in that it will periodically create a night star, and once 4 night stars have been created, they'll launch out and home in on enemies if there are any nearby, dealing cryo damage. The stars are created once every 1.5 seconds, but you can actually cause the shield to instantly create 2 stars every time your active character casts an elemental skill, once every 0.3 seconds. And in general, these stars help to output a teeny bit of personal damage, as well as apply a decent amount of cryo and generate cryo particles for Layla and her teammates. From what I've tested, every wave of her night stars can generate 1 to 2 cryo particles, so depending on the team, her energy requirement can vary quite dramatically. But it's also important to note that thanks to Layla's first Ascension passive, each of the first 4 night stars her shield creates will grant her 6% extra shield strength for a total of 24%, which is a nice boost to the shield's overall tankiness. And finally, with Layla's skill, her 4th Ascension passive will increase the damage of her shield's night stars by 1.5% of her max HP, and this is an additive bonus, so basically it's a decent increase in damage, but it's not a dramatic increase. Next up, Layla's elemental burst will summon a very large AoE zone surrounding a little moonchime thingy. This moonchime thingy will periodically launch starlight slugs at nearby enemies, dealing cryo damage based on a decent chunk of Layla's max HP. This burst, just like her skill, has a 100% uptime since it lasts for 12 seconds and the cooldown is 12 seconds, but since the cooldown is so short, casting her burst constantly will require Layla to invest in a pretty decent amount of energy recharge, especially if you haven't grabbed her second constellation. And the burst is important because it not only deals a respectable amount of personal damage as well as extra cryo application, but it actually grants her shield a night star every time it hits an enemy, up to 1 time every half a second. So it's quite useful for helping her shield generate more damage, more energy, and more utility during her rotation time. So in general with Layla's kit, you can expect her to fit into a lot of teams thanks to her practical cooldowns and simple playstyle, and she requires very little field time to set up her abilities, which is always a valuable attribute in Genshin's combat environment. With talent priority, you're going to want to level up her skill first and foremost, then her burst, and then you can comfortably ignore her attack talent if you don't plan on running off-meta playstyles with her. Alright, moving on to constellations, Layla is, for better or for worse, quite significantly buffed by her constellations, and they all provide some form of value, be it personal damage, energy enhancements, or shield enhancements. There's a lot to be had, but I do want to stress that she's still functional at C0, so don't buy into FOMO and blindly pull for her constellations unless you know what you're doing. At C1, Layla essentially gains a source of 20% more shield strength, as well as the ability to grant her co-op teammates a lesser version of her shield. The co-op part is a null point if you don't have friends, but the 20% extra shield strength is very nice, and it further increases the practicality of building her with shield's tankiness in mind. It is a pretty strong starter constellation if you're able to grab it, but moving on to C2, Layla's second constellation is extremely valuable. Layla's burst may only cost 40 energy, but do not let that fool you. Her battery potential is strictly tied to how quickly you can drive her shield's night stars, so in some teams she'll have very few energy issues, and in others she'll have a lot of energy issues. But with C2, each of her shooting stars grants her 1 energy upon hitting an enemy, which significantly reduces her energy requirement requirements across all teams, and makes it far easier to focus on her HP stats or her offensive stats. It's a staple constellation if you can get to it. C3 adds 3 levels to Layla's skill, which is quite nice for the extra shield absorption it provides per level, but the damage increase is rather forgettable, so it's a decent constellation but not a necessity. C4 allows Layla to buff her active character's normal and charge attack damage based on her max HP whenever her shooting stars fire, and the math behind this buff functions similarly to Yunjin's normal attack buff, so it will be stronger in some scenarios than it is in others, but overall, this is a respectable constellation for allowing Layla a form of buffing for her team. C5 grants 3 levels to Layla's burst, but all that does is increase the damage of the burst, so it's not terrible, but it's definitely her weakest constellation because her personal damage isn't that great to begin with. And finally, at C6, Layla's shooting stars and the starlight slugs from her burst deal 40% increased damage now, and her night stars are created a bit faster, so this is quite a nice constellation. It provides a pretty significant final boost to her personal damage, as well as allowing a means of driving her night stars faster, so she'll technically be providing more utility in her rotations. And overall, as I said, Layla's constellations are quite valuable, but luckily the strongest of them, and the only ones I'd say really make a difference with her gameplay, are C1 and C2, and even then she's perfectly fine and quite a nice character at C0. Moving on to Layla's best builds, I want to, as usual, start with her best artifact sets, because funny enough, there's only one set that I very highly recommend, but she does have options. First and foremost, 4-piece tenacity of the Millilith works absolutely perfect on Layla. She enjoys the 2-piece HP bonus and makes full use of the 4-piece bonus, including the shield strength and the team-wide attack bonus thanks to her night stars. And in general, this will be her best artifact set by quite a large margin because it consolidates so much utility so well for her. And there are teams she plays in that don't really need the 4-piece attack bonus, such as Fridge teams and Hyperfridge, Burgeon, etc. But even then, the scaling she benefits from with the 2-piece HP bonus and the shield strength increase is invaluable to her playstyle. Still, you can technically also use 4-piece Noblesse Oblige if you have good pieces, but I would only recommend this over 4-piece tenacity if you already have another teammate that uses tenacity as good as Layla does. And even then, it'll be difficult to fully benefit from the set's 4-piece bonus if your Layla isn't meeting her energy threshold and bursting straight off of cooldown, so that's something you'll have to consider when using this set over 4-piece tenacity as well. However, if you want to take Layla down a more offensive route, you can use sets like 4-piece Blizzard Strayer and 4-piece Emblem of Severed Fate, but as I've stressed a few times in this guide, Layla's personal damage isn't crazy. It is quite good considering she's technically a dedicated shielder, but it's not so good that you'll find insane value out of building with these two artifact sets, unless you're specifically running at high investment or you just want to have fun. So although these sets are functional on Layla, 4-piece tenacity and even 4-piece noblesse will provide far more value overall. And lastly, as temporary options, if you're still farming for a 4-piece set, you can run any combination of 2-piece tenacity, 2-piece emblem, 2-piece noblesse, or 2-piece Blizzard Strayer in order to build around offensive and or supportive stats. But what about those pesky artifact main stats once you've decided on the set you're going for? Well, Layla is a weird character because she can actually use quite a range of artifact main stats depending on your investment and your team comps. Generally, your best all-rounder option is to run an HP Sands, a Cryo Goblet, and a Crit Circlet, and this is because these main stats will allow her to run weapons like Fav Sword very effectively while still buffing her personal damage without losing much of her shield's tankiness. But if you're not running her with Fav Sword or you don't care about her personal damage, you can instead opt to build her entirely as a shield support, in which case you would want to run triple HP main stats. This will provide Layla with the tankiest shield and will still actually buff her burst damage by an okay amount, so that's nice. It's also worth noting though that in some teams where Layla is really struggling with energy, you can replace her HP Sands with an energy Sands, regardless of whether you're building her as an all-rounder or a shield support. And as for Layla's substats, as usual, your first priority should be energy recharge substats so that you can fill her energy requirements. For Layla, this requirement will drastically vary based on the team, but as a baseline, you can expect her to need around 160 to 200% ER in teams where she's the only cryo unit, and around 120 to 150% ER when paired with another cryo unit. And obviously these numbers can be much higher or lower depending on how well you drive Layla's Night Stars, whether you have teammates running Fav weapons, how often you plan to cast her burst, if you have C2, etc. But after you've found a comfortable energy threshold, you can then comfortably enjoy HP percent and crit substats with equal value. They're both strong on Layla, and although HP generally pulls ahead as a shield support, crit can still be nice for extra personal damage as well as more reliably proccing Fav Sword. And after those stats, attack substats are on Layla, and then defense and EM substats are generally just useless. Okay, Layla's best weapons. It's a short list. So obviously there are very few swords in the game that provide HP stats. In fact, there are only 2 of them, both of which are limited weapon banner exclusives and are 5 stars. But luckily, Layla is one of many recent characters that makes really good use out of a lot of budget-friendly options, so in relatively soft order, let's discuss her best options for for each given playstyle. First off, weapons like Key of Kajni Suit and Primordial Jade Cutter will be her best in slot when building Layla as a shield support, because they are the only swords in the game currently that provide HP stats to the wielder. Kajni Suit provides a huge HP bonus for Layla's shield and burst damage, plus it provides an elemental mastery buff to her team, which is very valuable in her Dendro teams and Melt teams, but is otherwise forgettable. And Jade Cutter happens to be her best sword for personal damage and just coincidentally also provides an HP bonus, so it's also good for her shield. It's a good all-rounder weapon for her. But if you don't have Jade Cutter, Harbinger of Dawn is surprisingly your next best option for Layla's DPS focused swords, because she doesn't suffer dramatically from the low base attack and quite enjoys the massive crit value that the weapon provides. Plus, she won't be on the field much, so it's very unlikely she'll lose the weapon passive. And finally, with my biggest recommendations, Favonia's sword is a very good weapon to run on Layla as a support, since she can proc the weapon passive so easily. Plus, she quite enjoys the energy bonus herself. And you should keep in mind that if you do run Fav sword on Layla, you'll generally want around 30% crit rate to reliably and quickly proc the energy particles. And there are other weapons Layla can use in certain scenarios, such as Skyward Blade, Festering Desire, etc., but my previous recommendations almost always outperform these options, and two of them are completely free and resource efficient to obtain. So those will remain as my highest recommendations across all of Layla's investment levels. So the final thing to discuss in this video is Layla's team options, and thanks to her versatility and practicality, she has quite a lot of viable teams that she works well in. Keep in mind, as a defensive focused unit, Layla will almost never be the optimal teammate choice for damage output alone, but that isn't necessarily a bad thing, because technically Zhongli, Kokomi, Jean, and other supportive characters can be the same way, but they're so popular because they provide a lot of utility and comfort to their teams. It's also important to note that since Layla has such easy access to her shield, and considering how strong it is, you can theoretically just slot her into any team that needs a shielder and doesn't mind having cryo application, much like Zhongli and Diona can do the same. So in this section, I'm going to talk about Layla's strongest teams currently and why they work so well, starting with Dendro teams. The first one I want to discuss is Fridge teams, because these teams used to be very mediocre. Fridge teams are essentially just bloom teams where you use Hydro and Dendro units to spam bloom explosions, but you add a cryo unit so that enemies will also be frozen, preventing them from attacking you and from running away before the bloom seeds explode. But there's also a cool mechanic that cryo auras present even if you're fighting enemies that can't be frozen, because cryo basically allows your Hydro characters to create more bloom seeds before they completely remove the Dendro aura applied by your Dendro character. And now that Nahida is in the game, creating a Fridge team around Nahida, Layla, and a Hydro unit can be extremely powerful in AoE combat, and Layla's shield can tank the bloom explosions efficiently, granting her quite a bit of value in this team as opposed to other cryo options. Additionally, Layla's cryo application and her battery potential in these Fridge teams are quite valuable, thus making her a prime cryo unit that consolidates multiple roles into one. And although Diona can work too, I wouldn't say she's explicitly a better option than Layla until she's C6. However, Layla also works very well with Hyper Fridge teams, in which you use her as the final flex spot after you've chosen a Dendro, Hydro, and Electro unit. Hyper Fridge functions exactly how a normal Hyper Bloom team functions, but the purpose here is to, once again, abuse the mechanics that cryo can provide to these reactions, such as occasionally freezing enemies, allowing more bloom seeds to be created, and in Layla's case, allowing a form of survivability that you otherwise might not have if your Electro unit isn't Kuki Shinobu. And as of right now, I would say that this is one of Layla's best teams, because Hyper Bloom is already extremely powerful and budget friendly, so being able to use your flex spot for yet another budget friendly character that provides so much value is very nice. And again, before the Diona comparisons ensue, I would argue Layla is a more practical cryo teammate than Diona in this team as well. I say this because the team can drive her Night Stars very efficiently, and Layla herself can abuse the lax rotation strategies across basically all of the team's variants. If your Diona is C6 though, that does typically change in her favor. Another similar team Layla works surprisingly well in is Burgeon teams. In this team, you'll use a Dendro, Hydro, and Pyro character to create Burgeon explosions, but weirdly enough, Layla works really well in the last slot to this specific team. With Toma and Xingqiu, Layla's shields will not only be protected by Toma's shield, but also by Xingqiu's Rain Sword orbitals, so it'll be far less likely to break even with the intense Burgeon damage. This means that Layla's utility generally won't be interrupted, so she can provide lots of survivability as well as reducing the amount of burning reactions you trigger, which would otherwise quite disrupt your Burgeon reactions. And in general, all of Layla's Dendro teams are quite nice, and she functions well as a support, but there is the issue of C6 Diona being a better overall support option. You could argue though that Layla's personal damage can make up for a decent amount of Diona's C6, and with Key of Kajni Suit, Layla could still pull ahead of Diona overall. But at similar investment, the point is that they're both quite competitive with one another in these teams. At a baseline, Diona provides a wider range of utility, whereas Layla provides a considerably stronger shield and more personal damage. But moving on, the next team that we obviously have to discuss is Freeze teams, and Layla's pretty decent in Freeze teams, but she doesn't provide much that we don't already have with other cryo character options. Layla is functional in Freeze teams and is technically technically a more offensive shield option than Diona, so at high investment she can be quite a bit more rewarding than Diona in freeze teams, but in general she isn't notably or explicitly better than other options, especially not when comparing to characters such as Shinha. Nonetheless, she is still quite respectable. She provides a strong and reliable shield as well as good cryo battery potential for characters such as Ayaka and Ganyu who really appreciate the particles, and even in budget-friendly freeze teams, Layla still finds quite a bit of value since these lower investment freeze teams tend to lean more towards quick swap teams, which Layla thrives in. So again, she's not introducing anything too crazy with freeze teams, but she is by absolutely no means a bad choice for these teams. And next, I want to discuss mono cryo teams. Mono cryo teams are pretty niche because they require you to have Shinha, but if you do have Shinha, I would argue Layla is the best character to use as your third cryo slot in the game currently. Since you're using the first slot for a cryo DPS and your last slot for an animal viridescent shredder, that usually leaves very little room for supportive utility in these teams, besides Diona, but Diona's personal damage is basically non-existent. Layla's, however, isn't terrible, and with high investment, it actually becomes pretty decent to the point where she gains a nice bit of value from Shinha's Icy Quills buff. Therefore, Layla consolidates a damage dealer and a shield support in this team even better than Diona can, making it that much more fun than it already was. And the last specific team archetype I wanted to discuss with Layla is melt comps, but more specifically reverse melt comps, because Layla tends to steal reactions when your DPS is a cryo unit like Melt Ganyu. However, for teams where you use Bennett as your melt carry, you'll actually find a pretty interesting and powerful synergy. Layla provides shields and decent cryo application for Bennett, and in return, Bennett triggers very powerful melt reactions on his burst and his skill. Plus, his skill is spammable, allowing him to quickly drive Layla's Night Stars for more particle generation and cryo application. It's pretty difficult to keep up with Bennett's pyro application by herself though, so Layla will usually need a second cryo unit such as Diona and an animal unit that can infuse with cryo to help keep up. But it's a respectable team, and Layla's interaction with Bennett makes it worth discussing. And in general with most melt teams, Layla's cryo application unfortunately cannot usually keep up with a pyro DPS on its own, so you'd have to compensate by adding more cryo units or an animal unit that can infuse cryo, you could add hydro units, etc. It's a weird team archetype and isn't typically easy to work with, but Layla can function in it if the team is built properly and you know what you're doing. And so overall with teams and with everything regarding Layla, I feel she's actually a pretty fair character, especially as opposed to the newer 4-stars we've been getting since Sumeru came out. She isn't explicitly better than any other characters within her playstyles, but she's actually also not explicitly worse either. She provides competitive value to a lot of characters within her niches, and beyond that, she's extremely easy to build and to play. I personally find that she provides the most value in Dendro teams, whether or not that was intentional since she hails from Sumeru, but she's also a decent option for freeze teams, melt teams, and just happens to be a respectable shielder for any team that needs a shield. And that about sums up this guide on Layla in 3.2. If you enjoyed this video or it helped you in any way, please leave a like and consider subscribing, and I will see you in the next video.